The first thing a woman notices is not always the message that never came. Sometimes, it is the way her own body keeps waiting. The phone is face down on the table, silent, harmless, almost ordinary, and yet some part of her still checks it as if checking could soften the ache. She tells herself she is not waiting anymore. She tells herself she is fine. She tells herself she has moved on. But the truth lives somewhere deeper than the words she repeats. It lives in the tightness under the ribs, in the little pause before she opens her notifications, in the strange heaviness that comes when she realizes she has been carrying the emotional weather of another person for far too long. This is how it often begins for the woman who gives too much, not with drama, not with a big collapse. It begins with small acts of forgetting herself. She answers one more call when she is tired. She explains one more thing she already explained. She smooths over one more disappointment. She makes one more excuse for someone else's distance. She keeps the peace. She keeps the connection alive. She keeps the door open. And because she is capable, because she is sensitive, because she can feel what others need before they ask, everyone around her starts to believe that her giving is endless. But nothing in a human being is endless. At some point, the part of her that has been quietly disappearing begins to harden. That hardening can look like coldness from the outside. People notice the change before she does. They say she is different. They say she is distant. They say she is not as warm as she used to be. They say it with confusion, sometimes with disappointment, sometimes with a little hurt in their own voice, as if they are entitled to the softness they consumed for free. What they do not see is the exhaustion that came before the cold. What they do not see is the private emotional labor of a woman who kept making room for everyone else, until there was almost no room left inside her own life. She did not become cold because she stopped caring. She became cold because caring without boundaries finally started to feel like self-erasure. And this is where the real story begins. Because the obvious explanation is always too small. People think the turning point is anger. They think she got tired of one specific person, one specific betrayal, one specific disappointment. Sometimes that is part of it. But the deeper truth is more uncomfortable. The coldness is usually not born from a single wound. It is born from a pattern of overextension that has been building for years. A woman does not usually become distant on a random Tuesday. She becomes distant after too many times of being the one who reaches first. After too many times of being the one who understands, the one who forgives, the one who absorbs the silence, the one who translates mixed signals into hope, the one who turns a half-hearted gesture into a meaningful story because she is trying to preserve the bond. She becomes distant after she has spent so long being the good one that she no longer knows where her own needs went. Carl Jung would have understood this not as a moral failure, but as a psychological adaptation. The psyche is always trying to balance itself. When one part of life is overused, another part rises to compensate. When a woman has built her persona around being kind, available, patient, and emotionally generous, the shadow does not disappear. It waits. It collects everything she is not allowed to feel. The resentment, the fatigue, the quiet anger, the disappointment, the humiliation of being taken for granted, the grief of realizing that being lovable was confused with being useful. The shadow is not evil. It is what the conscious personality has pushed away in order to stay acceptable. And for many women, the persona of the good woman is a very expensive mask. It smiles when it is tired. It says, "It's okay," when it is not okay. It says, "I understand," when it feels unseen. It says, "I don't mind," when it absolutely does mind. It keeps relationships from breaking, but it also keeps the truth from being spoken. And one day, after enough self-betrayal, the mask becomes too heavy to wear. That is when the coldness appears, not as cruelty, as conservation, not as punishment, as protection. There is a difference, and your body knows it even if your mind keeps trying to make excuses. You may have noticed that when you stop over-explaining, something in the dynamic changes. When you stop sending the second message, the third message, the message that rescues the conversation from awkward silence, the whole atmosphere shifts. When you stop being the emotional bridge, the other person has to face the distance they were hiding behind. And if you have spent years doing the bridging, they may suddenly experience your absence as if it were a new wound. But it was never new. It was only new to them because they were accustomed to your availability. This is one of the most painful truths for women who give too much. People can become deeply attached to the version of you that accommodates them, while remaining almost completely unaware of the cost to you. That is not always because they are malicious. Sometimes it is because they are unconscious. Sometimes it is because they are comfortable. Sometimes it is because your generosity became part of the relationship's furniture. It was always there. It held everything up. Nobody thanked the chair for holding their weight until the chair was removed. And then suddenly, everyone notices the chair. This is where projection enters the picture. A woman who gives too much is often not only loving another person, she is also unconsciously trying to secure an image. She is trying to be the one who is chosen because she has chosen so hard. She is trying to be the one who is seen because she has made herself so visible in service of the other. She is trying to earn safety by being indispensable. She is trying to prevent abandonment by becoming impossible to leave without guilt. That is not love in its purest form. It is love mixed with fear. Fear of being too much. Fear of being not enough. Fear of being replaced. Fear of silence. Fear of the empty space that appears when she stops performing care and discovers that care was being used to hold together a fragile sense of worth. Jung called attention to these invisible inner structures all the time, even when he used different language for them. The complex is like a knot in the psyche. It forms around an old emotional wound and then reacts to present situations as if the past is still happening. A woman with an abandonment complex may not be reacting only to the current man, the current friend, the current family member, the current relationship. She may be reacting to every earlier moment when love felt conditional, unpredictable, or withdrawn. So, when someone goes quiet, she does not just hear silence. She hears the old room. She hears the old ache. She hears the child inside who learned that if she is useful enough, maybe she will not be left. And that child, when it grows up without being fully seen, can become an adult who overgives in the name of love while quietly starving herself. This is why the coldness often arrives after a long season of warmth. It is not random, it is compensation. The psyche is trying to restore balance. It is saying, enough. Enough of being the emotional container for everyone else. Enough of shrinking your own needs to keep others comfortable. Enough of making your tenderness available to people who only know how to receive, not how to meet you. The body usually knows before the mind admits it. A woman begins to feel tired in places that sleep does not fix. Her voice gets flatter. Her smile takes longer to appear. Her patience shortens. The little things that used to slide off her skin now feel sharp. She looks at her phone and feels nothing, and that nothing is not emptiness. It is the first quiet sign that her system is no longer willing to pay the old price. Sometimes she calls this becoming cold, because that is the language other people use. But if she is honest, what she is becoming is harder to name, and far more important. She is becoming less available to her own self-abandonment. That is a very different thing. Because the moment a woman stops giving from a place of fear, she is no longer feeding the old dynamic. She is no longer saying, I will overextend myself so that you do not have to face your own lack. She is no longer saying, I will be endlessly understanding so that you do not have to become accountable. She is no longer saying, I will carry the emotional weight so that the relationship can stay comfortable for you. And when that pattern stops, the people around her often feel the loss before they understand it. They may call her cold. They may call her changed. They may accuse her of being distant, detached, even selfish. But often what they are really reacting to is the disappearance of a role they had come to rely on. This is another place where Jung becomes useful. Persona is not just a mask in the theatrical sense. It is the social face we wear to belong. It helps us function. It helps us meet the world. But when a woman's persona becomes the one who always gives, the one who never complains, the one who can handle everything, she can begin to confuse that role with her identity. Then the role becomes a prison with a beautiful name. Being kind becomes being convenient. Being patient becomes being silent. Being understanding becomes being invisible. Being loving becomes being available on demand. And if she has enough self-awareness, at some point she feels the cage before she can fully describe it. She knows that she is praised for qualities that are slowly draining her. She knows that people love the softness, but not the boundaries. They admire the generosity, but not the limits. They enjoy the warmth, but resist the truth. So she begins to withdraw. Not always dramatically, sometimes subtly. She stops volunteering the extra emotional labor. She stops initiating every repair. She stops making herself smaller to prevent tension. She stops trying to be the explanation for someone else's confusion. She stops being the one who rescues the atmosphere. And then something surprising happens. Her coldness is met with panic. Not always from everyone, but from the people who benefited most from her overgiving. The change can feel unbearable. They do not always know why, but they know the supply has changed. The emotional system has shifted. The old arrangement is no longer stable. This is the moment when many women feel guilt. And guilt can be very deceptive. It may feel like proof that she has become hard. It may feel like evidence that she is doing something wrong. It may sound like the voice of conscience, but often guilt is simply the alarm system of an old identity losing power. If you have been trained to believe that love means overfunctioning, then boundary setting will feel like betrayal. If you have been trained to believe that your value lies in how much you can absorb, then saying no will feel like violence. If you have been trained to keep everyone comfortable, then your own discomfort will feel like failure. But this is not failure. This is the beginning of individuation, and that word matters. Individuation is not becoming isolated or superior. It is the process of becoming more fully yourself, less divided by the demands of other people's expectations and your own unconscious fear. It is the slow movement away from living as a role and toward living as a whole person. A woman who gives too much often reaches a point where her psyche can no longer tolerate the split. One part of her is generous, kind, and open. Another part is exhausted, resentful, and quietly furious. One part wants to be loving. Another part wants to disappear. One part keeps saying yes. Another part is screaming no. When those opposites are not integrated, the psyche often swings hard. What was once overflowing warmth can become sudden frost. What was once endless explanation becomes silence. What was once open-hearted access becomes a locked door. People may only see the locked door. They rarely see the years of open windows. But the locked door did not appear to be cruel. It appeared because the house needed protection. There is a deep dignity in that. The woman who goes cold after giving too much is not always becoming less loving. She is often becoming more honest about the cost of love without reciprocity. She is learning that compassion without self-respect becomes leakage. She is learning that empathy without boundaries becomes a wound. She is learning that if she keeps giving when her body is saying no, she will eventually have nothing left to give that is clean, clear, and real. This is the part most people avoid, because it is easier to blame the person who withdraws than to face the pattern that made withdrawal necessary. It is easier to call her cold than to ask why warmth had to become self-sacrifice. It is easier to romanticize her giving than to respect her limits. It is easier to miss her when she changes than to value her while she was still open. And if you are the woman in this story, you may have spent a long time hoping that being even more understanding would finally be enough. You may have thought that if you just explained better, loved better, waited longer, softened more, then the other person would finally meet you halfway. But the deeper truth is that overgiving often attracts not more love, but less responsibility from the other side. Why? Because people unconsciously adapt to the terms they are given. If you never require effort, they may never develop it. If you always repair the rupture, they may never learn to handle discomfort. If you always absorb the emotional mess, they may never confront their own immaturity. This is not about blame. It is about pattern. And patterns are powerful precisely because they are familiar. The woman who gives too much often has a deep familiarity with being the one who holds everything together. She may have learned early that her emotional attunement was useful. She may have been the peacekeeper in the family, the strong one, the mature one, the one who sensed everyone else's mood and adjusted accordingly. This role can be praised so often that it becomes identity. Then, later, in adult relationships, she keeps performing the same function and calling it love. But love is not supposed to require the disappearance of the self. That is the turning point. The moment she sees that her coldness is not the enemy, she can stop shaming herself for the very thing that is trying to save her. The coldness is not the ideal state, but it is often the first honest response after years of emotional overexposure. It is the psyche's way of saying, I can no longer do this in the old way. And once she hears that, something changes. She no longer asks only, why are they like this? She begins asking, why did I stay so long in a dynamic that required me to leave myself? That question is sharper, more painful, more liberating, because now the focus moves from controlling the other person to understanding the inner pattern. She stops standing at the window of their behavior and starts looking at the architecture inside her own life. She sees where she confused intensity with intimacy. She sees where she confused being needed with being loved. She sees where she confused emotional labor with devotion. She sees where she used overgiving as a way to avoid the terror of not being chosen. This is not self-blame, it is self-recognition. And self-recognition is the beginning of freedom. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself in the comments. Not for anyone else, just to hear your own truth spoken clearly. A woman does not need to become hard to become whole. She needs to become honest. Honest about what drains her. Honest about where she overfunctions. Honest about how often she has mistaken endurance for love. Honest about the fact that her softness is sacred, but not when it is offered to people who treat it like a resource instead of a relationship. There is a difference between generosity and erasure. There is a difference between warmth and collapse. There is a difference between being open and being unprotected. Jung would have said, in essence, that what is not made conscious returns as fate. Not because the universe is punishing anyone, but because the unconscious repeats what the ego refuses to see. If a woman keeps returning to the role of the giver, the rescuer, the understanding one, then life will keep showing her the cost until she learns to recognize the pattern from the inside. And once she does, the coldness begins to soften into something wiser. Not immediate trust, not instant openness, not blind generosity, something steadier. She starts pausing before she answers. She notices the feeling in her body before she says yes. She lets silence be silence without rushing to fill it. She stops making her availability the proof of her love. She learns that boundaries are not a rejection of others. They are a declaration that her inner life matters too. This is where the shadow becomes useful again, because the shadow of the giving woman is often anger, clean anger. Not destructive rage, but the righteous anger that says, I mattered too. I was not put here to be endlessly consumed. I was not meant to be the emotional infrastructure for people who never learned to carry themselves. When that anger is denied, it leaks out as coldness, numbness, sarcasm, or sudden withdrawal. When it is acknowledged, it can become discernment. And discernment is far more powerful than overgiving. Discernment says, this person can have access to me only if they know how to meet me. Discernment says, I do not need to prove my worth by exhausting myself. Discernment says, I can love without losing my center. Discernment says, if my giving makes me smaller, it is no longer generosity. It is self-abandonment dressed in kindness. That sentence may sting, because it is true for more women than anyone wants to admit. The good news is that truth does not come to punish you. It comes to return you to yourself. And when a woman returns to herself, her energy changes in a way people can feel, even if they cannot name it. She is no longer trying to win love through depletion. She is no longer making herself easy to consume. She is no longer apologizing for having limits. She is no longer trying to be endlessly soft in a world that only respects what it cannot casually use. Her silence becomes clearer. Her yes becomes rarer. Her no becomes cleaner. Her presence becomes more intentional. She does not become cold in the sense of deadened. She becomes calm in the sense of no longer leaking herself into every open hand. That calm is not a performance. It is a recovered center. A woman who has reached that center may still feel tenderness. She may still care deeply. She may still love fiercely. But she no longer mistakes love for surrendering her own dignity. She no longer gives as if her survival depends on being chosen. She no longer enters relationships as a servant to uncertainty. And that is when she becomes difficult to manipulate. Not because she is trying to be difficult, but because she no longer abandons her own perception. The old pattern loses power when she stops feeding it. The emotional loop loses power when she no longer rushes to fill every silence. The guilt loses power when she recognizes it as the echo of an old role. The coldness loses its need to harden further when she begins to trust her own boundaries. This is the quiet miracle of psychological maturity. Not that life suddenly becomes easy, but that she no longer confuses pain with purpose. She no longer confuses overfunctioning with love. She no longer confuses being necessary with being cherished. She begins to understand that the woman who was warm enough to give too much was never weak. She was just unprotected in the places that mattered most. And the woman who goes cold is often the one who finally realizes that she cannot keep paying for connection with her own absence. Let that land. She cannot keep paying for connection with her own absence. At some point, the cost becomes too high. At some point, the self asks to be included. At some point, the soul stops negotiating. And then the coldness that frightened everyone else becomes the first sign that she is finally listening to herself. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to stop chasing what requires her to disappear. Enough to stop calling self-erasure love. Enough to stop giving the best of herself to people who only notice her when she is no longer available. That is not bitterness. That is awakening. And if you are in that place now, where your warmth has gone quiet and your old softness no longer comes so easily, do not rush to force it back. Do not shame yourself for the frost. Ask what it protected. Ask what it was too tired to keep carrying. Ask what part of you had been unheard for so long that it had to speak through withdrawal. Then listen. Because beneath the coldness, there is often a woman who is finally done proving that she deserves to exist. She already does. She always did. And when she remembers that, the phone can stay silent without owning her. The room can stay quiet without swallowing her. The old pattern can end without a dramatic apology. She can sit in her own life, breathe into her own body, and feel the first clean outline of a self that no longer needs to be earned through endless giving. My kindness no longer requires self-betrayal. Say that to yourself slowly, because it is not a sentence of hardness, it is a sentence of return. And when she returns, even if only a little, even if only enough to feel the difference, the coldness begins to change shape. It becomes less like a wall and more like a boundary, less like shutdown and more like wisdom, less like punishment and more like peace. The phone is still there, the room is still quiet, but she is no longer waiting in the same way. She is here.